December 11, 1978. 3 in the morning. 6 men in ski masks walk into a JFK cargo building and out with $6 million. The movie ends there. Credits roll. Henry Hill gets a new name and a quiet life. The real family behind that heist did not stop there, and neither did the killing. This is the real Lucchese family story, and it's far worse than Goodfellas ever portrayed. Section 1. The Iceman who started it all. Gaetano Reina was born on September 27, 1889, in Corleone, Sicily. His parents were Giacomo Reina and Carmela Rumore. In the early 1900s, while Reina was still a boy, his family packed up and moved across the ocean to New York City. They settled in East Harlem, on 107th Street, in a neighborhood packed with other Sicilian and Italian families who had made the same trip for the same reason. They wanted a better life, and many of them found it. Others found something different. Gaetano Reina found both. As a young man, Reina began working alongside his brother Antonio with members of the Morello crime family. The Morello family was one of the oldest and most established Italian criminal organizations in New York City at the time, and getting connected to them was not something that happened by accident. It meant Reina was already moving in serious circles before he was even an adult. He rose through the ranks and became a trusted captain under the family's boss, Giuseppe Morello, overseeing men and operations on behalf of the organization. In November of 1914, Reina's name came up in connection to the murder of a man named Barnett Baff. Baff worked in the poultry business, and he had been killed by hired gunmen after getting into conflicts with rival poultry dealers. Reina, along with another young gangster named Jack Dragna, was initially suspected of being one of the shooters. Investigators later determined that neither man had actually pulled the trigger, and both were cleared. But the fact that Reina's name was even part of that conversation shows how early he had built a reputation as someone capable of violence, someone whose name investigators thought to write down when a body turned up. Around this same period, in July of 1913, Reina's sister Bernarda married a man named Vincenzo Terranova. The Terranova family was closely tied to the Morello organization as well, which meant Reina's own family was becoming woven into the fabric of New York's Italian underworld through marriage, not just through business. This was common at the time. Family ties and criminal ties often ran through the same bloodline, and a wedding could double as a business alliance just as easily as a business deal could turn into a wedding. By the 1910s, the Morello family itself began to fall apart. Infighting, arrests, and shifting loyalties broke the organization down from the inside. Rather than go down with a sinking ship, Reina made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Alongside 2 other rising figures, Salvatore D'Aquila and Joe Masseria, Reina split away from the weakened Morello family and built something of his own. By 1920, Reina had done exactly that. He controlled criminal operations across the Bronx and parts of East Harlem, running his own independent organization for the first time. He installed a man named Tommy Gagliano, a former Morello family member, as his underboss. Gagliano was quiet and careful, the kind of man who preferred to stay out of headlines, and that instinct would matter a great deal later on. What made Reina's organization stand out from other crews running the usual mix of gambling and bootlegging wasn't dramatic violence or flashy heists. It was ice. This detail matters more than it might sound like it should. In the 1920s, home refrigerators barely existed for most working-class families. Instead, people kept their food cold using ice boxes, which were exactly what they sound like. Wooden cabinets with a compartment for a large block of ice that had to be delivered and replaced regularly. Every apartment building, every restaurant, every butcher shop and grocery store in a crowded city like New York depended on a steady, reliable supply of ice just to keep food from spoiling. Whoever controlled ice delivery controlled something that touched nearly every single household in the neighborhood, every single day. Reina's family built a monopoly over icebox distribution throughout the Bronx. This wasn't a side racket. It was the backbone of the entire operation. Because ice was a necessity and not a luxury, people had no real choice but to pay whatever price was set and buy from whoever controlled the supply chain. If a business owner wanted to switch to a cheaper ice dealer, that option didn't really exist, because Reina's organization had already made sure there wasn't a cheaper option to switch to. This gave Reina both a steady, dependable stream of cash and enormous leverage over an entire community, all without needing constant public displays of force. People paid because they had no other choice, not because they were being threatened at gunpoint every week. Alongside the ice business, Reina's crew ran other rackets that fit the same pattern of steady, lower-profile income. During Prohibition, when the sale of alcohol was illegal across the entire country, Reina's organization got involved in bootlegging, smuggling, and distributing liquor to a city that had no intention of stopping its drinking just because the law told it to. His crew also ran a numbers game, a kind of illegal lottery that took small bets from working people, mostly Italian and Jewish residents of Harlem and the Bronx, hoping to turn a few cents into a bigger payday. None of this was the kind of headline-grabbing crime that got a boss's picture in the newspaper. It was steady, low-key, and profitable, and that was exactly how Reina wanted it. Away from the rackets, Reina was building a family life as well. In 1913, he married a woman named Angelina Oliveira. Together they had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. The family lived in a home on Rochambeau Avenue in the Norwood section of the Bronx, a regular residential street, where a man could raise a household while running an empire just a few miles away. One of his sons, Giacomo, would go on to become a member of the Lucchese family himself later in life, following directly in his father's footsteps. One of his daughters, Carmela, who went by the name Mildred, would grow up to marry a man named Joseph Valachi in 1932, 2 years after her father's death. That marriage happened despite objections from her mother, her brother, and her uncles, none of whom wanted her involved with him. Decades later, Joseph Valachi would become one of the most important informants in the history of American organized crime, becoming the first Mafia insider to testify publicly about the existence and inner workings of the American Mafia to the United States government. The man who married into Reina's family would eventually help expose the very world Reina had helped build. As the 1920s went on, Reina formed a partnership with a rising and increasingly powerful figure named Giuseppe Masseria, more commonly known as Joe Masseria or Joe the Boss. Masseria had absorbed the remnants of the old, weakened Morello organization into his own growing operation, and he was quickly becoming one of the most dominant mafia figures in New York City. Aligning with Masseria offered Reina protection and access to a wider network, and for a while, the arrangement worked well for both men. Interestingly, Reina's early organization also had a hand, even if indirectly, in shaping 2 of the most important criminal figures of the next 50 years. As teenagers, 2 young men named Tommy Lucchese and Charlie Luciano, the same Luciano who would later become known across the country as Lucky Luciano, ran together as part of what was known as the 107th Street Gang. That gang operated under Reina's jurisdiction in East Harlem. In other words, long before Tommy Lucchese ever gave his name to this crime family, and long before Lucky Luciano became one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history, they were both young men coming up through the same streets Reina controlled. In 1925, a man named Salvatore Maranzano arrived in New York City from Sicily. Maranzano took control of a rival organization based out of the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, a group tied to immigrants from a town called Castellammare del Golfo. Maranzano was ambitious, disciplined, and determined to become the single most powerful mafia figure in the country. That ambition put him on a direct collision course with Joe Masseria, who had no intention of sharing power with anyone. The tension between these 2 men would eventually explode into a 2-year conflict that tore apart the old structure of organized crime in New York City and rebuilt it into something new. That conflict became known as the Castellammare War. At first, Reina stayed loyal to Masseria, just as he had been for years. But as the war dragged on, Masseria began demanding a bigger and bigger cut of the profits Reina's organization brought in, treating Reina less like a partner and more like a subject who owed tribute. Reina, unwilling to keep handing over larger shares of the empire he had spent years building, began quietly negotiating a switch in loyalty to Maranzano instead. It was a calculated gamble. If it worked, Reina could position himself on the winning side of the war while shedding Masseria's growing demands. If it failed, it would cost him everything. It failed. Masseria learned of Reina's secret negotiations with his enemy. To a man like Masseria, this wasn't just a business disagreement. It was betrayal, plain and simple. And in his world, betrayal only had one answer. On the evening of February 26, 1930, Gaetano Renina left an apartment in the Claremont section of the Bronx. Some accounts say he had just left the home of a woman named Marie Ennis, while other accounts describe it instead as his aunt's apartment, where he had gone for dinner. Either way, as he stepped out into the evening, gunmen were waiting for him. He was ambushed and shot with a double-barreled shotgun, killing him instantly in the doorway. He was 40 years old. The New York Times covered his death the following day, describing him in its headline as a wealthy ice dealer who had been shot down as he left an apartment separate from his family home in the Bronx. To the outside world reading the morning paper, he was simply a rich businessman gunned down in the street, a strange and violent crime with no clear explanation. To the people who actually knew who Gaetano Reyna was and what he controlled, the murder made perfect sense. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. His death is widely believed to have been carried out on Masseria's orders, though accounts differ slightly on exactly who pulled the trigger, with some pointing to a young enforcer named Vito Genovese, a man who would go on to build and lead his own powerful crime family in the years that followed. Reyna's murder marked one of the very first major killings of the Castellamarese War, a conflict that would go on to reshape organized crime across the entire country. Out of that war would eventually come the modern structure of the 5 families and the commission that governed them, the same basic system of organized crime that would still be operating in New York City decades later, long after everyone involved in the war itself was dead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Masseria wasn't finished making decisions about Reyna's old organization. Rather than promoting one of Reyna's own loyal men to take over, Masseria installed an outsider, a man named Joseph Pinzolo, nicknamed Fat Joe, to run the crew Reyna had spent a decade building from the ground up. Reyna's 2 most trusted men, Tommy Gagliano and Tommy Lucchese, the same men who had loyally served under him for years, were passed over completely. Section 2. Betrayal, a shotgun, and the war that built the 5 families after Gaetano Reyna was gunned down outside a Bronx apartment in February 1930. The men who had loyally served him for years expected one of their own to take over. That did not happen. Instead, Joe Masseria, the most powerful mafia boss in New York City at the time, installed an outsider named Bonaventura Pinzolo, a man most people called Joseph or Fat Joe, to run the organization Reyna had spent a decade building. Pinzolo was born in Sicily in 1887 and had moved to the United States as a young man. Long before he ever ran a crime family, he had already built a criminal record of his own. In 1908, he was arrested for trying to bomb a building at 314 East 11th Street in Manhattan as part of a Black Hand extortion scheme, a common tactic at the time, where criminals threatened business owners with violence unless they paid protection money. When investigators pressured Pinzolo to testify against his own boss in that case, a Camorra leader named Giuseppe Costabile, he refused, and that refusal cost him 5 years in prison. By 1930, decades after that arrest, Pinzolo had worked his way into Masseria's inner circle, and Masseria rewarded that loyalty by handing him control of the organization Reyna had left behind. From the very beginning, the arrangement was a disaster. Tommy Gagliano and Tommy Lucchese, the 2 men who had actually earned their positions under Reyna through years of work, were passed over completely. Neither man had any respect for Pinzolo, and it did not take long for that resentment to spread through the rest of the crew. Part of the problem was simply who Pinzolo was as a person. Charlie Luciano, the same man who would go on to become one of the most influential organized crime figures in American history, reportedly described Pinzolo in blunt terms, saying that as bad as Masseria could be, Pinzolo was worse in almost every way, fatter, uglier, and dirtier than Masseria on his worst day. Whether or not every word of that description holds up, the broader point stuck. Pinzolo had a talent for making enemies, and he made them quickly. Gagliano did not sit quietly and accept the situation. According to later accounts from Mafia boss Joseph Bonanno, Gagliano formed a splinter group inside the organization, together with Lucchese and a handful of other loyal men, including a member named Dominic Petrilli, who happened to be a friend of a young mobster named Joseph Valachi. Valachi would later become infamous decades down the road as the first mafia insider to publicly testify to the United States government about the inner workings of the American mafia, but at this point in 1930, he was simply a young man on the fringes of a power struggle inside one crime family. The tension came to a head on September 9, 1930. Pinzolo was lured to an office inside the Brokaw building on Broadway in Manhattan, a space that had actually been leased 4 months earlier by Tommy Lucchese himself. That detail alone tells you the trap had been planned well in advance. Inside that office, Pinzolo was shot 5 times and killed. There are 2 competing versions of exactly who pulled the trigger. Valachi later claimed the shooter was a man named Girolamo Santuccio, sometimes recorded as Santucci, while Luciano's own account pointed instead to Dominic Petrilli. Neither man was ever arrested for the killing. Lucchese himself was indicted in connection with the murder, since it happened in an office under his name, but the charges against him were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. Pinzolo's time running the organization lasted less than 6 months, one of the shortest reigns of any crime family boss in the history of the American Mafia. He left behind a widow and several young children. With Pinzolo dead, Masseria made a different decision this time. He appointed Tommy Gagliano to head the family, the same man he had passed over just months earlier after Reina's murder. It is worth pointing out how strange this situation actually was. Gagliano and Lucchese had almost certainly played a direct role in engineering the death of the man Masseria placed above them, and yet Masseria responded by handing Gagliano exactly the position he had been denied in the first place. Some historians believe Gagliano and Lucchese had already secretly aligned themselves with Masseria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano, even while still publicly pledging loyalty to Masseria. If true, that means the two men were playing both sides of the war at once, waiting to see which direction the wind would ultimately blow before fully committing. To understand why any of this mattered beyond a single crime family in the Bronx, it helps to step back and look at the bigger picture. By the late 1920s, Joe Masseria controlled the most powerful and profitable mafia operation in the United States, with influence spreading across Brooklyn, Manhattan, sections of the Bronx, and significant portions of New Jersey. He had become the dominant figure in New York's underworld after a previous rival, Salvatore D'Aquila, was killed in 1928, following a separate, earlier gang war. But a new challenger had emerged from Brooklyn's Sicilian immigrant community. His name was Salvatore Maranzano, nicknamed Little Caesar, born in the town of Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily. Maranzano had once studied to become a priest before turning to organized crime instead, and he arrived in New York in the mid-1920s with ambitions that matched Masseria's own. The conflict between these two men and their organizations became known as the Castellamarese War, named after Maranzano's hometown, and it stretched across roughly 2 years, from 1929 into 1931. Historians estimate the war claimed more than 60 lives before it was over, a staggering number of killings driven by a single power struggle between two aging bosses who both wanted to be the undisputed leader of organized crime in America. Reina's murder in February 1930 had been one of the earliest and most significant killings connected to that larger war, since it was Reina's decision to consider defecting from Masseria to Maranzano that triggered his death in the first place. Pinzolo's murder that September only added to the body count and deepened the divide inside what had once been a single, functioning organization. As the war dragged into 1931, two of the Mafia's rising younger figures, Charlie Luciano and a man named Meyer Lansky, began to see the entire conflict differently than their older bosses did. Both men understood that the constant bloodshed was drawing far too much attention from police and the public, and that neither Masseria nor Maranzano represented the future of how organized crime should actually operate. Rather than continue serving under a boss they viewed as outdated and increasingly reckless, Luciano opened secret negotiations with Maranzano's side. The deal was simple. Luciano would arrange for Masseria to be killed, and in exchange, Maranzano would recognize Luciano as one of the most powerful men in the newly reorganized Mafia once the war ended. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at a restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro in Coney Island, a place Masseria had visited many times before and had no reason to distrust. The two men ate for roughly 2 hours, sharing a simple meal before settling into a card game. At some point during the afternoon, Luciano excused himself, reportedly to use the restroom. Within moments, a group of gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Masseria multiple times at the table where he sat. He died face down among the playing cards. Accounts of exactly who fired the shots vary between historical sources, though several point to a group of men that included Bugsy Siegel, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia, all of whom would go on to become significant organized crime figures in their own right over the following decades. Masseria's death effectively ended the Castellamarese War in Maranzano's favor, and Maranzano wasted no time declaring himself the winner. He held a meeting at the intersection of 187th Street and Washington Avenue in the Bronx, and proclaimed himself Capo di tutti capi, an Italian phrase meaning boss of all bosses, the single most powerful figure in the entire American Mafia. From that position, Maranzano laid out a plan meant to bring peace to an underworld that had just spent 2 years tearing itself apart through constant killing. His plan organized Italian-American organized crime across the country into 24 separate families, each one allowed to elect and run its own leadership. In New York City specifically, Maranzano divided the local organizations into 5 families, each headed by a different boss. Those 5 bosses were Maranzano himself, Charlie Luciano, Vincent Mangano, Joseph Profaci, and Tommy Gagliano. This is the exact moment where the structure known today as New York's 5 families was officially created, and Gagliano, the same quiet, low-profile man who had loyally served under Gaetano Reina for years, was now sitting at the very top of that new system as one of its 5 founding bosses. Maranzano's reign at the top did not last long. Luciano, who had just helped eliminate Masseria in exchange for a position of power under Maranzano, was not interested in serving under yet another boss who wanted absolute control over everyone beneath him. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano was murdered in his own office in Manhattan, killed by men sent on Luciano's orders. Some accounts describe several of those men posing as government agents to get past Maranzano's own bodyguards before attacking him with knives and gunfire. That same evening became known in later mob folklore as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, tied to rumors, most of which historians now consider exaggerated, that a wave of coordinated killings targeting old-school Sicilian mafia bosses swept the country all at once. With both Masseria and Maranzano dead within the same year, Luciano moved quickly to reshape the entire structure of organized crime in America. Rather than naming himself the new boss of all bosses, and repeating the exact same mistake that had gotten both of his predecessors killed, Luciano helped establish a governing body known as the Commission. Instead of one single all-powerful leader sitting above every family, the Commission gave the bosses of the major crime families roughly equal standing, creating a system meant to settle disputes between families without resorting to the kind of citywide war that had just killed dozens of men in less than 2 years. This structure, built directly out of the ashes of Reina's murder, Pinzolo's murder, Masseria's assassination, and Maranzano's death, became the foundation of organized crime in New York City for decades to come, and versions of it were still recognized by federal prosecutors investigating the Mafia many decades later. For the organization that had once belonged to Gaetano Reina, the end of the Castellamarese War marked the beginning of a completely different chapter. Tommy Gagliano, who had survived 2 bosses being murdered above him and had likely helped orchestrate at least one of those killings himself, now sat as one of the 5 official bosses recognized under the new commission system. Unlike some of his fellow bosses, who chased headlines, built public reputations, and eventually paid for that visibility with prison time or worse, Gagliano took the opposite approach entirely. He kept the organization's activities low-key and concentrated primarily in the Bronx, Manhattan, and New Jersey, avoiding the kind of publicity and internal chaos that had defined the family's founding years. He issued the vast majority of his orders through his trusted underboss, the same man who had stood beside him through the killings of both Reina's replacement and the 2 rival bosses above them, Tommy Lucchese. Gagliano would go on to lead the family with this same quiet, careful style for the next 21 years, a stretch of time so free of major public incidents that comparatively little detail about his day-to-day rule survives, compared to what is known about almost every other mafia boss from that same era. That silence was not an accident, it was the entire strategy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The family Gagliano, now controlled, had already survived a founder's assassination, a hated outside boss, murdered in an office rental scheme, and a 2-year war that reshaped organized crime across the entire country. What came next was a period of calm that would eventually put a new name at the very top, a name that would end up attached to the organization for the rest of its history, and a man whose talent for staying out of prison and out of headlines would turn out to be even sharper than Gagliano's own. Section 3. The quiet boss who beat the system for 16 years. Gaetano Lucchese was born on December 1, 1899, in Palermo, Sicily, to parents named Baldassare and Francesca Lucchese. In 1911, when he was around 11 or 12 years old, his family made the trip across the Atlantic and settled in East Harlem, the same crowded working-class Italian neighborhood that had already produced Gaetano Reina and countless other figures who would go on to shape organized crime in New York City for decades. As a child, Lucchese lost his right index finger in an accident. That single detail would follow him for the rest of his life, because it eventually earned him one of the most well-known nicknames in Mafia history. Police officers began calling him Three-Finger Brown, a reference to a popular Chicago Cubs pitcher of the era named Mordecai Brown, who had lost part of a finger in a childhood farming accident and went on to become a star player anyway. The nickname stuck to Lucchese so tightly that most people who knew of him at all knew him by that name rather than his given one. Lucchese fell in with the local gang scene in East Harlem as a teenager, running with the same 107th Street crowd that connected him to a young Charlie Luciano. Over the following years, he built a reputation inside the neighborhood's criminal circles, eventually coming to the attention of Gaetano Reina, the boss who would go on to build the organization that Lucchese would one day inherit and rename after himself. Despite decades spent in organized crime, at the center of murders, extortion schemes, and rackets worth enormous sums of money, Lucchese was only ever convicted of a single crime in his entire life: automobile theft, a charge from 1921 that sent him to Sing Sing prison for a stretch. That is the full extent of his criminal record according to the justice system. Everything else, every murder he was suspected of, every racket he ran, every dollar that moved through his organization, never resulted in a conviction. That fact alone separates Lucchese from almost every other major organized crime boss of his era, most of whom eventually saw the inside of a prison cell for years at a time, if not for the rest of their lives. Lucchese became a naturalized United States citizen on January 25, 1943, in Newark, New Jersey. That naturalization would later come back to haunt him. Years afterward, once his name had become tied to organized crime in the public record, the United States Attorney General at the time, James P. McGranary, moved to have Lucchese's citizenship revoked and have him deported back to Italy. The government argued that Lucchese had lied on his naturalization application by failing to disclose earlier arrests connected to two murders, one from 1928 involving a man named Sarasulo, and the other from 1930 tied to the killing of Joseph Pinzolo, the same short-lived boss whose murder had cleared a path for Tommy Gagliano to take control of the family years earlier. The case against Lucchese dragged on for years through the court system. In 1957, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately ruled in Lucchese's favor, finding that the government's case did not meet the legal standard required to strip someone of their citizenship. Lucchese kept his American citizenship and stayed in the country for the rest of his life. When Tommy Gagliano died in 1951, after leading the family quietly for 2 decades, Lucchese was the obvious choice to take over. He had served as Gagliano's underboss for 22 years by that point, effectively running the day-to-day operations of the family on the street, while Gagliano stayed almost entirely out of public view. The transition of power happened without the kind of internal war or bloody power struggle that had marked the family's earlier years under Reina and Pinzolo. Lucchese simply stepped into the role he had already been performing in practice, and from that point forward, the organization carried his name instead of Gagliano's. Lucchese wasted no time building alliances with 2 other rising figures in New York's underworld, Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino. Together, the 3 men worked to gain significant influence over the Commission, the governing body that had been created years earlier out of the ashes of the Castellamarese War, to settle disputes between the 5 families. This alliance mattered because it meant Lucchese was no longer just managing his own organization. He was helping shape decisions that affected organized crime across the entire city. The connection to Gambino went beyond business. Lucchese's daughter married Carlo Gambino's son, Thomas Gambino, tying the 2 family lineages together through marriage in a way that mirrored how Gaetano Reina's own daughter had married into a rising criminal figure decades earlier when she wed Joseph Valachi. In the world Lucchese operated in, marriages between families were rarely just personal decisions. They reinforced business relationships and created loyalty that could outlast any single individual's lifetime. Publicly, Lucchese presented himself as a legitimate businessman. He held a position as vice president of a garment factory called Brownell Limited, located on East 9th Street in Manhattan, and he leaned heavily on that image whenever anyone questioned how he actually made his money. Behind that respectable front, Lucchese's real influence ran through garment worker unions, longshoremen unions, and trucking unions across the city, along with connections reaching into New York City government, and even its entertainment industry. Manhattan's garment district in particular became one of the family's most valuable and consistent sources of income under Lucchese's leadership, giving him control not just over criminal rackets, but over legitimate businesses that depended on union labor to function at all. If a clothing manufacturer wanted labor peace, meaning no strikes, no slowdowns, no disruptions from the unions that controlled its workforce, dealing with Lucchese's organization, directly or indirectly, was often part of doing business in that industry at all. Trucking and cargo theft made up another major pillar of the family's operations during this period. Trucks moving goods through New York City's garment district were frequently targeted for hijacking and theft, and the family expanded this same approach to cargo moving through Idlewild Airport, the massive new airport that had opened in Queens and would later be renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport. Planes arriving at Idlewild regularly carried valuable cargo, including jewelry, imported goods, and large amounts of cash, and the family built rackets around targeting those shipments long before the airport ever became connected to one of the most famous heists in American history. Lucchese also cultivated relationships with New York City politicians that gave his organization protection most criminals could only dream of. The family built close ties to Mayor William O'Dwyer and to judges across the city who owed favors or loyalty in one form or another. In 1945, Lucchese backed a man named Vincent Impellitteri for president of the New York City Council, positioning him as a natural successor when Mayor O'Dwyer eventually stepped down. That is exactly what happened. When O'Dwyer resigned in 1950, Impellitteri became acting mayor. Tammany Hall, the powerful political machine that had long controlled Democratic politics in the city, refused to back Impellitteri for a full term, and instead supported a judge named Ferdinand Pecora for the position. Rather than back down, Lucchese quietly threw his support behind Impellitteri's independent campaign against Pecora, campaigning under a slogan promising to be unbought and unbossed, even while receiving quiet backing from the very organized crime network that slogan was supposedly rejecting. Impellitteri won the election. Once accusations of mob ties to Impellitteri's career surfaced publicly during the 1950 campaign, Impellitteri cut ties with Lucchese to protect his own reputation, but the fact that Lucchese had been able to help install a sitting mayor of New York City in the first place says everything about how deep his political reach had become. In 1952, Lucchese was called to testify before the Kefauver Committee, a special United States Senate committee formed specifically to investigate organized crime and figure out how to fight it. His testimony, along with testimony from other major organized crime figures across the country, brought unprecedented national attention to the Mafia as a real, organized institution rather than just scattered local gangs. Committee counsel Rudolph Halley reportedly told the press that on a national level, Lucchese was considered the man at the very top, a bigger figure in organized crime than almost anyone else being investigated at the time. During his testimony, when pressed about his associations, Lucchese acknowledged social or business contact with a long list of prominent public officials, including Mayor Impellitteri, the late Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, former Congressman Vito Marcantonio, a United States District Attorney, and multiple federal judges. Marcantonio had reportedly even helped arrange for Lucchese's son to be appointed to West Point, the United States Military Academy, a detail that shows just how far Lucchese's political connections actually reached into legitimate American institutions. The year 1957 turned out to be a disastrous one for organized crime across the country as a whole, but a relatively good one for Lucchese personally. That year brought the start of the McClellan Committee, another major Senate investigation focused specifically on corruption tied to labor unions and the Teamsters. It also brought the murders of two significant organized crime figures, Frank Scalise and Albert Anastasia, along with a near-fatal shooting and forced retirement for Frank Costello, the man who had long served as the Mafia's primary political fixer in New York, before Lucchese effectively took over that same role. That same year also brought the infamous meeting at Appalachian, New York, where more than 50 organized crime bosses and figures from across the country gathered at a private estate, only for the meeting to be discovered and broken up by state police, leading to a wave of arrests and a massive surge in public and federal attention toward the Mafia as a nationwide criminal network rather than a collection of separate local gangs. Lucchese avoided attending the Appalachian meeting entirely, a decision that likely spared him from the arrests, subpoenas, and intense scrutiny that followed for many of the bosses who did show up. That same year, the appeals court also ruled in Lucchese's favor in his citizenship case, closing out a legal threat that had hung over him for years. The following year, on July 3, 1958, Lucchese was called to testify again, this time before the United States Senate's Labor Rackets Committee, which was investigating organized crime's infiltration of labor unions across the country. During that appearance, Lucchese held up his right hand, missing its index finger, for photographers in the room, becoming the first organized crime figure willing to publicly discuss any details about himself during that particular investigation, even while denying under oath that he belonged to the Mafia at all. By the early 1960s, federal authorities shifted their approach and attempted to build a tax evasion case against Lucchese instead, following the same general strategy that had once been used to finally convict Al Capone decades earlier in Chicago. Despite this pressure, Lucchese managed to avoid a conviction on those charges as well, maintaining the same pattern that had defined his entire career up to that point. Whatever authorities threw at him, whether it was denaturalization proceedings, Senate committee subpoenas, or tax investigations, Lucchese found a way to come out the other side without ever adding a second conviction to his record. Lucchese's health began to decline in the mid-1960s. He suffered from a brain tumor that gradually weakened him over time. In April of 1967, he returned to his home in Lido Beach, on Long Island, where he had lived for years while presenting himself publicly as a successful businessman rather than the head of one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations. He died there on July 13, 1967, at the age of 67. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Queens. His death closed out a run of 16 years as boss of the family that now carried his name, following 22 years spent as underboss before that. Across more than 3 decades inside organized crime, spanning multiple Senate investigations, a denaturalization attempt, and constant federal attention, Lucchese never spent another day in prison after his original auto theft conviction as a young man. He had built one of the most politically connected criminal organizations in the country, with reach extending into the mayor's office, the courts, and Washington itself, all while keeping his own name almost entirely out of the kind of tabloid headlines that had destroyed other mafia bosses of his era. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After Lucchese's death, a man named Carmine Tramunti took over as the family's next boss. But the organization Lucchese left behind carried forward the exact operations he had spent 16 years building and protecting, the same rackets running through Manhattan's garment district, the same control over trucking unions across the city, and the same steady stream of stolen cargo moving through the airport that had replaced Idlewild's old name with a new one just a few years earlier. An airport that was about to become the site of a much bigger, much more famous crime than anything the family had pulled off up to that point. Section 4. The Airport Rackets. Goodfellas only hinted at, long before anyone had ever heard the word Lufthansa connected to a crime, the Lucchese family had already spent close to 2 decades treating one specific piece of real estate in Queens like a private bank they could withdraw from whenever they needed cash. That piece of real estate was an airport. Before 1963, it was called Idlewild Airport. After 1963, it was renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport, in honor of the president who had been assassinated that November. The name changed. The crime running through its cargo terminals did not. Airports like Idlewild made an almost perfect target for organized crime, and understanding why requires understanding what actually moved through a place like that in the 1960s and 1970s. International flights arriving from Europe and elsewhere routinely carried enormous amounts of cash, jewelry, and valuable cargo, often stored temporarily in warehouse buildings and vaults on the airport grounds before being transferred elsewhere. Airlines needed workers to load and unload that cargo, drive it around the tarmac, and truck it out of the airport toward its final destination. Every one of those jobs represented a potential point of access for anyone willing to bribe, threaten, or simply befriend the right worker. And because so much of the airport's cargo movement depended on labor unions representing truck drivers, dock workers, and cargo handlers, whoever controlled those unions effectively controlled how smoothly, or how disastrously, cargo moved through the airport at all. The man who came to represent the Lucchese family's grip on that world was Paul Vario, a Kappa regime, meaning a captain, inside the organization. Vario was born in New York City on July 9, 1914. His criminal record started early. At age 11, he served 7 months in juvenile detention simply for truancy, skipping school. As he grew into adulthood, his arrest record expanded to include loan sharking, burglary, tax evasion, bribery, bookmaking, contempt of court, and assault. Though like many organized crime figures of his generation, arrests rarely translated into meaningful prison time. Vario built and ran his own crew operating primarily out of East New York, a working-class section of Brooklyn. He conducted much of his day-to-day criminal business out of an old German bar called Gefkin's, located on Flatlands Avenue, and a junkyard on Avenue D in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn. That junkyard reportedly served as an operational hub where Vario oversaw hijackings, loan sharking, bookmaking, and the fencing of stolen goods, meaning the process of selling off stolen property through a network of buyers who did not ask questions about where it came from. Vario's crew became known as one of the most consistently profitable operations inside the entire Lucchese family, and the bulk of that money came directly from hijacking trucks leaving JFK Airport. According to Henry Hill, one of Vario's own associates, who later became a government witness, the airport functioned like the crew's personal bank, a place they could return to again and again whenever they needed money. Vario's influence extended directly into the Cargo Haulers Union, representing many of the workers at JFK, giving him a powerful tool beyond simple theft. If law enforcement or airport management ever pushed too hard on an investigation into missing cargo, Vario could threaten a labor strike through his union connections, using the threat of shutting down operations at one of the busiest airports in the world as leverage to make problems disappear. Decades later, FBI agents listening through hidden microphones reportedly overheard Lucchese family members and associates boasting that they owned JFK outright, a claim that, while exaggerated, reflected just how deeply the family's influence had settled into the airport's daily operations by that point. Vario was not the only organized crime figure exploiting the airport. Crews connected to the Gambino crime family, including one led for years by Carmine Fatico and later by a rising figure named John Gotti, also worked JFK's cargo terminals for their own profit. This meant the airport was not controlled by any single family in a simple, exclusive arrangement. Multiple crews operated there simultaneously, each carving out territory, each occasionally needing to pay tribute or coordinate with rival factions to avoid stepping on each other's operations. One of the most important figures to come out of Vario's crew was a young man named Henry Hill Jr., born on June 11, 1943, in Brooklyn. His father was an Irish-American electrician named Henry Hill Sr., and his mother, Carmela Costa Hill, was Sicilian-American. Henry grew up in Brownsville, a poorer section of East New York, as one of 9 children in a working-class household. From an early age, he was fascinated by the mobsters who socialized at a cab stand directly across the street from his home, men connected to Paul Vario's crew, who carried themselves with a kind of confidence and visible wealth that stood out sharply against the daily grind most families in the neighborhood experienced. In 1955, when Hill was just 11 years old, he wandered into that cab stand looking for a part-time job after school. Over the following years, he began running errands for the men who spent their time there, gradually working his way into the orbit of Vario's operation. In 1956, at age 13, Hill met James Burke for the first time, while serving drinks and sandwiches at a card game. Burke's habit of handing out generous tips left a strong impression on the teenager, who had never encountered anyone quite like him before. The following year, Vario's family members rewarded Hill's usefulness by arranging a union card for him in the bricklayer's local, a document that let him collect a weekly salary from a construction payroll without ever actually showing up to do the work, a practice commonly known inside these circles as a no-show job. By his early teens, Hill had effectively abandoned any interest in school in favor of this new life. He dropped out of high school around age 14 to devote himself fully to working for the men in the neighborhood he admired so much. His first serious criminal act, by his own later account, involved setting fire to a rival cab stand that was competing with Vario's own operation, a task the organization wanted handled and trusted Hill enough to assign to him. At 16, Hill was arrested for the first time, caught using a stolen credit card. Despite facing pressure from investigators, he refused to give up any information beyond his own name, a decision that earned him real credibility with Vario and Burke. Vario's own attorney arranged Hill's bail, cementing the relationship between the teenager and the organization that would define the rest of his life. James Burke, the man Hill had met as a teenager and would go on to work alongside for decades, was born on July 5, 1931, in New York City. He earned 2 nicknames over the course of his career: Jimmy the Gent, a reference to his generous tipping and outwardly polite manner, and the Big Irishman, a nod to his ancestry. That ancestry mattered more than it might seem. Traditional Mafia rules required that a man be fully Italian on his father's side to ever become a made member, meaning a formally inducted member of the organization with full voting rights and protections. Burke's Irish background meant he could never become a made man himself, no matter how much money he earned or how much trust he built with Vario and the rest of the Lucchese family. Instead, he operated as one of the most valuable and successful associates the family had, proving that ethnicity, while it limited formal rank, did not limit how much responsibility or how much money a non-Italian associate could handle if he proved capable enough. Burke's own criminal record stretched across decades and included convictions for forgery in 1949, extortion in 1972, conspiracy in 1982, and second-degree murder in 1985. He owned a bar in the South Ozone Park section of Queens called Robert's Lounge, which functioned as an informal headquarters for his crew, a place where jobs were planned, money was divided, and problems were discussed away from prying ears, or at least that was the intention. Burke became a mentor to several younger men over the years, including Henry Hill, a hijacker named Thomas DeSimone, and another associate named Angelo Sepe, training them in the specific skills that made a good cargo thief: patience, timing, inside information, and the willingness to move quickly once an opportunity presented itself. That inside information usually came from workers employed directly at the airport, men who had access to cargo manifests, delivery schedules, and security arrangements that outsiders had no way of knowing. A tip from the right cargo employee could tell a crew exactly which truck to hit, when it would be most vulnerable, and what it was actually carrying, turning what looked from the outside like a random robbery into a carefully planned operation, with inside knowledge behind every decision. This exact pattern played out in one of the largest cargo thefts at JFK before Lufthansa ever entered the picture. In April of 1967, associates connected to the Lucchese family stole $420,000 in cash from the Air France cargo terminal at JFK Airport, an amount worth roughly $3 million in today's money. Cargo theft at JFK was common enough by 1967 that this robbery stood out specifically because of its size, becoming the largest cash robbery to happen at the airport up to that point. The job was carried out by Henry Hill, Robert McMahon, Thomas DeSimone, and a man named Montague Montemurro, working off a tip from McMahon himself, who had inside access to Air France's cargo operations. According to later accounts, Hill and Burke drove to the Air France cargo parking lot around 11:40 at night on a Saturday in a rented car fitted with false license plates, then left the airport with the full $6 million haul once the theft was complete. Afterward, Hill and DeSimone paid a combined $750,000 in tribute money, split between 2 organized crime figures who had a stake in what happened at the airport: Sebastian Alloy, a 57-year-old capo in the Colombo crime family who considered Kennedy Airport part of his own territory, and Paul Vario, the 2 men's own capo in the Lucchese family. That tribute payment illustrates something important about how the airport actually functioned as criminal territory. It was not run by one family with exclusive rights. It was shared ground, and pulling off a job there meant paying the right people afterward to keep the peace between competing organizations. Burke's criminal career did not go entirely unpunished during this period, even if convictions were rare relative to the scale of what he was actually involved in. In November of 1972, Burke and Hill were arrested in Tampa, Florida, after beating a man named Gaspar Ciaccio, who allegedly owed a gambling debt to a union boss connected to their circle named Casey Rosado. Both men were charged with extortion, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg. Burke ended up serving 6 years of that sentence before being paroled and returning to his criminal career in New York, picking up right where he had left off with the same crew, the same airport, and the same general playbook that had worked for years. By the mid-1970s, the ecosystem around JFK Airport looked remarkably consistent with how it had operated for over a decade. Paul Vario still controlled his crew and maintained influence over the cargo haulers union. Jimmy Burke, still ran his operation out of Robert's Lounge, training younger men in the specific art of hijacking trucks and robbing cargo shipments. Henry Hill had grown from a teenage errand runner into a full participant in that same criminal economy, moving stolen goods, running loan sharking operations, and helping plan robberies alongside the same men who had recruited him off the street as a child. Cargo theft, labor racketeering, and airport-based crime had quietly become one of the most reliable, most consistent sources of income the Lucchese family had, generating steady money year after year without the kind of citywide attention that murders and gang wars tended to attract. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of it, not the Air France robbery, not the years of routine truck hijackings, not the tribute payments carefully split between rival families, had prepared the public for what this same network of men was about to attempt at the same airport just a few years later. A tip was coming, passed along through the same kind of gambling debt and inside connection that had fueled robberies at JFK for years, except this time, the target would not be a few $100,000 from a single cargo hold. This time, the number involved would be big enough to make history. Section 5, the $6 million heist that became a movie. The idea for the biggest cash robbery in American history at the time did not come from a hardened career criminal planning a big score. It came from a cargo supervisor at Lufthansa named Louis Werner, a man drowning in a gambling debt he could not pay off. Werner worked at John F. Kennedy International Airport, handling cargo operations for the German airline. Through his job, he had detailed knowledge of something most people outside the airline industry never thought about. Roughly once a month, Lufthansa flew large amounts of cash into JFK, money that had been exchanged in Germany by American servicemen and tourists, converting their dollars before heading home or heading overseas. That cash typically sat inside a vault in the airline's cargo building overnight, sometimes for an entire weekend, before being picked up and transferred into local banks. Werner knew the schedule, he knew the layout, he knew which employees would be on duty and when. At the time, Werner owed roughly $20,000 in gambling debt to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman, who also ran a wig shop as a legitimate front business. Rather than face the consequences of an unpaid debt to a man connected to organized crime, Werner made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He suggested to Krugman that the two of them could arrange to steal the cash sitting in that Lufthansa vault, and he asked Krugman to find men capable of actually pulling the job off. Krugman took that idea and passed it along to a man named Henry Hill, an associate connected to the Lucchese crime family through his relationship with capo Paul Vario and hijacker James Burke. Hill, in turn, brought the idea directly to Burke, the same man who had mentored him since childhood and who had spent years building a reputation as one of the most capable cargo thieves operating out of JFK Airport. Burke recognized immediately that this was a different kind of opportunity than the truck hijackings and smaller cargo thefts his crew had pulled off for years. This was potentially the biggest score any of them had ever touched. Before Burke could move forward, the job needed approval from Paul Vario, the capo both Burke and Hill answered to inside the Lucchese family structure. According to later accounts, the idea was presented to Vario over the phone while he happened to be in Florida at the time. Vario approved the plan quickly, but he set one condition: Burke, who was in prison at the time, on an unrelated matter, would need to personally oversee the operation once he was available to do so. Planning for the heist took shape over the following months, much of it happening at Robert's Lounge, the bar Burke owned in the South Ozone Park section of Queens that had served as an informal headquarters for his crew for years. Werner supplied the crew with detailed intelligence, maps of the cargo building's layout, information about which employees would likely be on shift during the robbery, the location of the vault, and the precise timing of when the largest cash shipments would be sitting inside it, unguarded overnight, waiting to be picked up. Burke assembled a crew to carry out the actual robbery. Among those believed to have participated, based on later court testimony and investigative reporting, were Thomas DeSimone, known for a violent temperament that made him useful for keeping frightened employees under control during a robbery, Angelo Sepe, Joseph Manri, known by the nickname Buddha, Luis Scafora, Paolo Licastri, Robert McMahon, an Air France cargo employee who had inside knowledge of airport operations from his own job, and Vincent Asaro, a made member connected to the Bonanno crime family who reportedly helped plan the job and was cut in on the proceeds to maintain peace between the different organized crime factions that considered JFK Airport their shared territory. On Friday, December 9, 1978, Werner alerted the crew that a large cash shipment had arrived at the airport and would remain sitting in cargo storage for the entire weekend, since the money was not scheduled to be transferred into an armored Brinks truck and delivered to Chase Manhattan Bank until the following Monday. That gap gave Burke's crew exactly the window they needed. At around 3 o'clock in the morning on Monday, December 11, 1978, a black Ford Econoline van pulled up outside the Lufthansa cargo building at JFK Airport. Inside the van sat a group of men, most accounts describing 6, though some later testimony suggested as many as 8 participated directly in entering the building, all wearing black ski masks and gloves to hide their identities. The crew used a pair of bolt cutters to slice through the padlock securing the facility's perimeter gate, a barrier that was only 6 feet high and topped with barbed wire, hardly the kind of serious security measure one might expect to be protecting millions of dollars in cash. Using a key that Werner had provided in advance, the men entered the building through an outside door without needing to force their way in. Once inside, the robbers moved quickly and methodically. Airport employees working the overnight shift were forced at gunpoint into the building's lunchroom, where they were made to lie down on the floor. According to later accounts, the robbers handled the employees with a level of restraint that avoided serious physical harm, focused entirely on completing the theft rather than escalating the situation into unnecessary violence. At least one guard was reportedly injured slightly during the initial confrontation, but no one inside the building was seriously hurt during the entire operation. With the employees under control, the crew turned their attention to the vault itself. A night shift supervisor was forced to disable the building's alarm system and open the double-door vault where the cash and jewelry were being held. Werner's inside information had told the crew exactly how the vault operated and what to expect once they got it open. Once inside, the robbers began pulling out cartons packed with cash and jewelry, working through dozens of individual boxes stacked inside the vault. Some accounts describe as many as 72 separate cartons being carried out during the robbery, each one loaded into the waiting van outside. The entire operation, from the moment the van first pulled up to the moment it drove away from the airport, took a little over an hour, wrapping up sometime around 4:30 in the morning. When the robbers finally left, they took with them approximately $5 million in untraceable cash and roughly $875,000 in jewelry, a total haul worth close to $6 million in 1978, an amount worth well over $20 million when adjusted for inflation into today's money. It stood, at the time, as the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States. The plan itself, and the robbery as it actually unfolded that morning, went off almost flawlessly. Almost immediately afterward, things began to fall apart, though not because of any mistake made during the theft itself. One of the crew members, Parnell Edwards, known by the nickname Stacks, had been given a simple, specific instruction after the job was finished: drive the stolen getaway van to a junkyard in New Jersey where it could be destroyed, erasing any physical evidence connecting the vehicle to the crime. Instead, Edwards drove the van to his girlfriend's home and left it parked in a no-parking zone, where it was quickly spotted, towed, and eventually connected back to the robbery. That single decision, ignoring a simple order meant to protect the entire crew, became the first thread investigators had to pull on, and it also set off a chain of events that would prove far more dangerous to the people involved than the robbery itself ever was. In the immediate aftermath, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a major effort to identify and prosecute everyone involved in the theft. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Burke's crew as the most likely suspects, given his crew's long history of cargo theft at the exact same airport, but building an actual criminal case proved far more difficult than simply having a strong suspicion about who was responsible. Physical evidence connecting Burke directly to the heist was thin. Witnesses willing to testify against him were even harder to come by, partly because many of the people originally involved in the robbery began disappearing or turning up dead in the months that followed, a pattern that made the investigation even more complicated rather than easier to solve. Unable to build a strong enough case against Burke and his crew directly, federal investigators eventually shifted their focus toward the one clear inside connection they could actually prove: Louis Werner, the Lufthansa cargo supervisor whose gambling debt had started the entire chain of events in the first place. With testimony from a Lufthansa employee named Rolf Rebmann, described in some accounts under the name Grunewald, prosecutors were able to build a case tying Werner directly to the planning of the robbery. In 1979, Werner was convicted on 6 separate charges connected to the heist. Rather than fight the case to its full conclusion, Werner chose to cooperate with prosecutors to some degree, and his original sentence of 15 years was ultimately reduced down to 5. After serving his time, Werner married his girlfriend, and the two of them entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, disappearing from public view entirely. Werner remains, to this day, the only person ever formally convicted specifically for carrying out the Lufthansa robbery itself. Despite the involvement of numerous organized crime figures believed to have participated directly in planning and executing the theft, and despite decades of investigation that followed, the robbery itself resulted in exactly one conviction. Almost none of the stolen money or jewelry was ever recovered by authorities. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story did not end there for the people connected to the robbery. While Werner faced prison time and eventually disappeared into witness protection, a very different fate was already unfolding for the men who had actually walked into that cargo building wearing ski masks, carried out boxes of cash, and driven away into the night believing they had just pulled off the perfect crime. Section 6. The Body Count. The movie left out. Within days of pulling off the largest cash robbery in American history, the men behind the Lufthansa heist began dying, one after another, in a pattern that stretched across the following 8 months, and left behind a body count that outnumbered the 6 or so masked figures who had actually walked into that cargo building. The first to go was Parnell Edwards, known to everyone as Stax. Edwards had been given one simple task after the robbery was finished: drive the stolen getaway van to a junkyard in New Jersey where it could be destroyed, removing any physical evidence that might connect the crew to the crime. Instead, Edwards drove the van to his girlfriend's house and left it parked illegally on the street, where it was quickly towed and eventually traced back to the robbery. That single failure to follow orders put the entire operation at risk of being unraveled through simple forensic work on an abandoned vehicle. About a week after the heist, Edwards was shot and killed inside his own apartment in Queens. Investigators later came to believe the killing was carried out on Jimmy Burke's orders, a punishment for putting the whole crew in danger through carelessness. The next to disappear was Martin Krugman, the bookmaker whose gambling debt collection from Louis Werner had set the entire robbery in motion in the first place. Krugman had a direct financial stake in the outcome of the heist, since it was his idea to bring Werner's tip to people capable of turning it into an actual robbery. In the weeks following the theft, Krugman reportedly grew increasingly insistent about receiving his promised cut of the money. That insistence, combined with growing fear inside the crew that Krugman might eventually talk to federal investigators to protect himself, made him a liability in Burke's eyes. Krugman vanished in early January of 1979. His body has never been found. According to some accounts, he was killed and dismembered, with his remains disposed of in a way meant to make sure nothing was ever recovered. In 1986, 7 years after his disappearance, Krugman was formally declared legally deceased, and his wife received a payout of $135,000 from his life insurance policy. Around the same period, a woman named Teresa Ferrara disappeared as well. Her body washed ashore roughly a month later, and to this day, no one has ever been charged in connection with her death or disappearance. Her case remains one of the more mysterious threads tied to the broader Lufthansa investigation, connected closely enough in timing and circumstance to the other killings that investigators have long treated it as part of the same pattern of people being silenced in the aftermath of the robbery, even without a formal conviction ever being secured. In Florida, 2 more men connected to the case met the same fate. Richard Eaton and Tom Monteleone ran a restaurant and club together and were accused of skimming money from the stolen Lufthansa cash that had been funneled through their businesses as part of an effort to launder it, meaning to disguise stolen money as legitimate earnings so it could be spent without drawing suspicion. Eaton was killed in January of 1979. His body was discovered bound at the hands and feet, frozen solid inside a refrigerated meat delivery truck, found by children who had no idea what they had stumbled across. Monteleone, Eaton's associate in the same skimming scheme, was killed the following March. His body was never recovered. That same month, in March of 1979, Luis Cafora and his wife Joanna disappeared together. Luis had been one of the men who physically participated in the robbery itself. In the aftermath, Burke had given a clear instruction to everyone involved: Do not make large, obvious purchases with the stolen money, since flashy new spending was exactly the kind of behavior that could draw police attention back toward the crew. Luis Cafora ignored that instruction and bought his wife a custom pink Cadillac, a purchase visible enough to anger Burke and, according to later accounts, convince him that Cafora could no longer be trusted to keep quiet or stay disciplined. Both husband and wife disappeared that March. Their bodies, along with the car itself, have never been found. By May of 1979, 5 months after the heist, 2 more men connected to the robbery turned up dead. Robert McMahon, who worked in cargo operations for Air France at JFK and had helped plan an earlier robbery of that same airline back in 1972, and Joseph Manry, known as Buddha, who also worked in cargo operations and had helped identify which Lufthansa employees would need to be taken hostage during the actual robbery, were both offered a chance to enter witness protection in exchange for testifying against Burke. Both men refused. On May 16, 1979, their bodies were discovered inside a parked car in Brooklyn, each killed execution style, with a gunshot to the back of the head. Investigators determined the 2 men had known whoever killed them, since the killer had apparently been sitting in the back seat of the 2-door car at the time of the shooting, a detail that meant the killer had to physically climb over the bodies to get back out of the vehicle afterward. Newspaper coverage at the time noted that Manry was publicly known to be tied to the Lufthansa case, while McMahon's connection to the robbery was less immediately obvious to reporters, even though investigators privately understood exactly why both men had been targeted together. Roughly 1 month after that, on June 13, 1979, the body of Paolo Licastri was discovered on a burning trash heap in Brooklyn, riddled with bullet wounds, found shirtless and shoeless on Flatlands Avenue. Licastri had represented the Gambino crime family's interest in the robbery, tasked with making sure that organization received its agreed-upon cut of the stolen money, a cut reportedly worth around $200,000, since JFK Airport was shared territory between multiple crime families, and cutting the Gambinos out entirely was never a realistic option once the robbery had actually happened. Not every murder connected to this period came directly from Burke covering up the Lufthansa heist itself. Thomas DeSimone, one of Burke's closest friends and one of the men who had physically participated in the robbery, disappeared later that same year, under different circumstances entirely. DeSimone had a reputation for a violent, unpredictable temper, and he had reportedly murdered members of the Gambino crime family without receiving permission first, a serious violation of organized crime protocol that put his own life in danger regardless of anything related to Lufthansa. In retaliation, the Gambino family had him killed. His body, like so many others connected to this entire chapter, was never found. Angelo Sepe, another member of Burke's crew who had participated in covering up several of the earlier killings connected to the heist, met his own violent end years later, in July of 1984, more than 5 years after the original robbery. By that point, Sepe had begun stealing cash and cocaine from a drug dealer connected to the Lucchese family, a betrayal that had nothing directly to do with Lufthansa, but everything to do with the same underlying culture of paranoia, greed, and quick violence that had defined the entire crew since the day the heist took place. His own family, the same organization he had spent years working for, ultimately decided he could no longer be trusted and had him killed. Taken together, the murders connected to the Lufthansa heist and its aftermath stretched across the better part of a decade, though the vast majority happened within the first 8 months following the robbery itself. Depending on which killings are counted as directly connected versus only loosely related, the total death toll runs somewhere between 8 and 12 people, a number that dwarfs the size of the crew that actually walked into the Lufthansa cargo building that December morning. Burke, the man believed to be behind most of these killings, was never charged or convicted specifically for the Lufthansa robbery itself. He was, however, eventually convicted of murdering Richard Eaton, one of the 2 Florida associates accused of skimming heist money, a conviction that finally gave prosecutors a way to put him behind bars for a crime tied directly back to the aftermath of the heist, even without ever successfully charging him for the robbery that started the entire chain of killings. Burke died of lung cancer in 1996 while incarcerated at a hospital in Buffalo, New York, having been transferred there from Wendy Correctional Facility. He never publicly admitted to ordering any of the murders connected to Lufthansa, and because so many of the bodies were never recovered, and so many of the people who might have testified against him were among the dead, prosecutors were never able to build a case connecting him directly to most of the killings widely believed to be his doing. what the Lufthansa heist and its aftermath demonstrated, more clearly than almost any other single event in Lucchese family history, was how quickly a successful crime could turn into a death sentence for the very people who pulled it off, once paranoia, greed, and fear of informants took hold inside a crew. Burke's purge left behind bodies in refrigerated trucks, burning trash heaps, and cars parked on Brooklyn streets, and it happened almost entirely without a single major public trial connecting most of the killings to the man believed responsible for ordering them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern, a crime family turning its own violence inward against its own members out of fear and suspicion, would not stay contained to Jimmy Burke's crew or to the 1970s. Within a decade, a very different generation would take control of the Lucchese family entirely, and the scale of killing that followed would make Burke's 8-month purge look almost restrained by comparison. Section 7. The underboss who made the movie mobsters look. Tame Anthony Salvatore Casso was born on May 21, 1942, in Brooklyn, New York, the youngest of 3 children born to Michael and Margaret Casso. Both sides of his family had come to the United States from the Campania region of Italy back in the 1890s, settling in South Brooklyn near the waterfront, an area built around the docks where cargo ships unloaded goods from around the world, and where organized crime had already put down roots decades before Casso was ever born. His godfather, a man named Salvatore Calambrano, was a made member and captain in the Genovese crime family, one of the organizations that held real influence over the Brooklyn docks. That kind of connection meant Casso grew up surrounded by organized crime almost from birth, even though his own father tried to steer him away from it. Michael Casso had his own record of burglary arrests going back to the 1940s, but by the time his son was growing up, he had settled into honest work as a longshoreman, meaning a laborer who loaded and unloaded cargo from ships at the docks. He reportedly urged his son to stay away from the criminal life he himself had briefly touched. Anthony Casso did not take that advice. Instead, he grew up admiring his father's earlier reputation, and he later gave himself the nickname Gas Pipe, supposedly inspired by a weapon his father had once favored. As a boy, Casso developed a reputation among his friends for being a skilled and enthusiastic shooter. He and a group of neighborhood kids used rooftops in the neighborhood as an informal shooting range, and Casso reportedly fitted a .22 caliber rifle with a homemade silencer so he could shoot birds off tenement buildings and brownstones without drawing attention from the police or neighbors. He ran with a local gang known as the South Brooklyn Boys, getting into the kind of street fights and minor trouble that were common for teenagers in that neighborhood at the time. Casso dropped out of school at 16 and took a job working alongside his father as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks. That job put him in daily contact with the same organized crime networks that controlled hiring, theft, and labor peace at the waterfront. And it did not take long for his aggressive personality to catch the attention of a Lucchese crime family figure named Christopher Furnari, known as Christy Tick. Furnari brought Casso into his crew, a group known informally as the 19th Hole Crew, starting him off as a loan shark and bookmaking enforcer, meaning someone who collected debts and enforced payment through threats and violence when people fell behind on illegal loans or gambling debts. One incident from this period, recounted by a detective who investigated Casso years later, gives a sense of the personality that would define his entire criminal career. A dock worker mentioned that he had recently bought a new pair of work boots. Casso responded by operating a forklift and deliberately dropping roughly 500 pounds of cargo onto the man's feet, breaking most of his toes, then laughing afterward and joking that he simply wanted to test how good the new boots really were. That mix of casual cruelty and dark humor became something close to a signature for Casso throughout his life in organized crime. It was Furnari who paired Casso with another rising young mobster named Vittorio Amuso, more commonly known as Vic Amuso. The two men became close partners almost immediately, working together throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s on a wide range of criminal enterprises, including extortion of construction contractors and trucking companies who needed labor peace to keep their businesses running smoothly, gambling operations, and drug trafficking. Beyond their work for the Lucchese family directly, Casso and Amuso also ran with a highly skilled burglary crew known as the Bypass Gang, which specialized in breaking into banks and jewelry stores across Manhattan and Long Island, using technical skill to bypass alarm systems and vault security rather than relying purely on threats or violence. Casso's early criminal record shows a pattern that would define much of his career. Frequent arrests followed by almost no lasting consequences. He was convicted of bookmaking in 1962 and of attempted bribery in 1974. Between 1965 and 1977, he was arrested 5 separate times on charges ranging from assault with a gun to heroin trafficking, and every single one of those cases ended in dismissal, usually because witnesses who might have testified against him refused to cooperate, whether out of fear or loyalty. In 1977, Casso and Amuso were both swept up in a major heroin trafficking case connected to a drug pipeline running from Thailand through the Sicilian Mafia and into the United States, though even that case failed to keep either man out of criminal life for long. Casso officially became a made member of the Lucchese family sometime in the late 1970s, formalizing a status that had really been earned years earlier through his work with Fernari and his partnership with Amuso. From that point forward, the two men rose together, extorting money, running rackets, and building reputations as two of the most reliably violent and effective operators inside the entire organization. Casso's rise eventually put him in direct contact with, and conflict against, some of the most significant organized crime figures of the era. He confessed in later years to direct involvement in several major killings that reached far beyond the Lucchese family's own internal business. Among the murders Casso admitted responsibility for was the killing of Frank DeCicco, an underboss in the Gambino crime family. DeCicco was killed by a car bomb in 1986, in the aftermath of the unauthorized killing of Gambino boss Paul Castellano, ordered by John Gotti without the commission's approval. The bombing was connected to a broader effort by Genovese boss Vincent Gigante, allied with Amuso and Casso, to retaliate against Gotti for stepping outside the traditional rules governing how a boss could be removed and replaced. Casso also confessed to involvement in the killing of Roy DeMeo, a Gambino associate notorious for his own brutal reputation within organized crime circles, and the murder of a man named Vladimir Reznikov. Beyond these specific killings, Casso admitted to participating in multiple separate attempts to assassinate John Gotti himself, attempts that ultimately failed, but reflected just how far the conflict between Gigante's allies and Gotti's Gambino organization had escalated during this period. Casso's willingness to use murder as a tool extended into corrupting law enforcement itself. He developed a working relationship with 2 decorated New York City police detectives, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, who he paid for information, and eventually, direct assistance in carrying out killings. On November 6, 1990, the 2 detectives pulled over Edward Lino, a capo in the Gambino crime family, along the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. Caracappa walked up to Lino's car and shot him at close range. Casso had suspected Lino of involvement in an earlier attempt on his own life, and he paid the 2 detectives an estimated $65,000 for carrying out what he later described as this piece of extra work. This relationship between a Lucchese underboss and 2 active-duty NIPT detectives would eventually become one of the most shocking organized crime stories in New York City history, though the full scope of it would not become public for years. By 1990, federal prosecutors had built enough evidence against Casso to indict him on charges of racketeering, extortion, and murder. Rather than face those charges directly, Casso went underground, becoming a fugitive who spent the next several years hiding in a series of safe houses across New Jersey. From those hidden locations, he maintained active control over Lucchese family operations through an elaborate network of coded telephone calls, trusted messengers who carried information back and forth, and occasional secret meetings arranged in New York City with subordinates he still trusted. During these years as a fugitive, Casso's paranoia about informants and disloyalty inside the organization reached extreme levels, and it translated directly into a wave of internal killings that federal prosecutors later described, using language typically reserved for full-scale campaigns of terror. Casso reportedly compiled a list targeting as many as 49 separate individuals, a mix of mob associates and suspected government cooperators he believed needed to be eliminated to protect himself and the organization. Among the confirmed victims from this period was Capo Anthony DeLappy, shot and killed in Las Vegas on February 4, 1990, on Casso's orders, based on suspicion that he had been cooperating with the FBI. An associate named Bruno Facciolo was abducted, tortured for information, and murdered in August of that same year, after the earlier killing of his son had drawn unwanted law enforcement scrutiny toward the family's operations. One of the most significant attempted killings from this period targeted Capo Peter Chiodo, a co-defendant of Casso's in a separate federal case, who had pleaded guilty without first getting approval from Lucchese family leadership, a serious breach of internal protocol in Casso's eyes. On May 8, 1990, Chiodo was shot 12 separate times in an assassination attempt. Remarkably, he survived. Rather than remaining loyal after barely escaping death at his own family's hands, Chiodo made the decision to cooperate with the government instead, becoming a witness against the very organization that had just tried to kill him. In early 1991, still angered by Chiodo's survival and his decision to cooperate, Amuso and Casso ordered additional violence connected to the situation, and Casso later denied direct involvement in some of the specific acts connected to punishing Chiodo's extended family, though the broader pattern of retaliation against anyone even loosely connected to a cooperating witness remained consistent throughout this period. That same year, in September 1991, a man named Alphonse Darco, who had been serving as acting boss on the street while Amuso and Casso stayed in hiding, became convinced that Casso had marked him for death as well, following Darco's own failure to successfully carry out the earlier hit on Chiodo. Rather than wait to find out if that suspicion was correct, Darco surrendered to federal authorities and agreed to testify, becoming the first sitting Mafia boss in history to turn government witness. Both Chiodo's and Darco's decisions to cooperate opened the door for entirely new murder indictments against both Amuso and Casso, tightening the net around two men who had spent years staying just ahead of federal prosecutors through a combination of violence, hiding, and internal loyalty enforced through fear. That net finally closed on January 19, 1993. Federal agents arrested Casso as he stepped out of the shower at the home of his mistress in Bud Lake, New Jersey, bringing an end to nearly 3 years spent as a fugitive. The arrest marked the effective conclusion of Casso's career as an active underboss, capable of directing violence from hiding, and it opened an entirely new chapter in his life that would look almost nothing like the one before it. Facing overwhelming evidence and the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison without any hope of release, Casso made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the young man who once idolized his father's criminal past and grew up despising informants above almost anyone else in the underworld. In March of 1994, Casso pleaded guilty to a 72-count indictment covering murder, racketeering, and extortion charges, and he agreed to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence and a place inside the Witness Protection Program. During his cooperation, Casso initially confessed to involvement in 12 murders. When prosecutors continued pressing him for additional details about his criminal career, that number grew substantially, eventually reaching a total of 36 murders he admitted direct involvement in ordering or carrying out himself, along with claims that he had ordered the execution of roughly 100 more people over the course of his criminal career, though many of those broader claims were never independently confirmed. In May of 1996, Casso made his only public appearance as a cooperating witness, testifying before the United States Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which was examining the emergence of Russian organized crime groups and their connections to New York's 5 families. During his testimony, Casso confirmed that he had been in custody since his 1993 arrest, and explained that he had chosen to cooperate with the government rather than proceed to trial, entering a plea agreement that required him to provide truthful information about his criminal history in exchange for consideration at sentencing. That cooperation agreement did not survive much longer after his Senate appearance. Federal investigators and prosecutors grew increasingly skeptical of Casso's honesty as his cooperation continued, discovering that he had lied about the true extent of his personal finances and had denied responsibility for certain violent acts that investigators believed he had actually committed, including retaliatory violence connected to Peter Chiodo's family. When FBI agents administered a polygraph test covering some of these disputed claims, Casso failed it. Beyond the credibility problems, Casso's behavior while incarcerated and cooperating grew increasingly erratic, eventually including bribes and assaults that violated the basic terms of his agreement with the government. In July of 1997, Judge Frederick Block of the Federal District Court in Brooklyn found that Casso had breached his cooperation deal, and prosecutors formally rescinded the agreement the following year, removing him from the Witness Protection Program entirely and stripping away the sentencing benefits he had been counting on in exchange for his testimony. Without the protection of his cooperation agreement, Casso faced the full weight of the charges against him, In 1998, a federal judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 455 years in prison, covering convictions for racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, bribery, extortion, and tax evasion. It stood as one of the longest and most severe sentences ever handed down against a major organized crime figure in American history, reflecting both the sheer number of crimes Casso had admitted to and the government's anger at having been misled during his brief period of cooperation. Casso spent the remainder of his life in federal custody, eventually incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona, one of the most secure facilities in the federal prison system. In 2009, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer while still behind bars. He remained in prison for the rest of his life, never again given the chance to walk free or benefit from the cooperation deal he had once believed would spare him from spending his final years in a cell. Anthony Casso died on December 15, 2020, at the age of 78, in Tucson, from complications related to COVID-19 while still in federal custody. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The violence Casso left behind, the murders inside his own family carried out purely on suspicion, the corrupted police detectives on his payroll, and the years spent directing killings from hidden safe houses while federal agents searched for him, represented one of the bloodiest chapters in the entire history of the Lucchese crime family. And Casso had not acted alone during any of it. His partner in nearly every one of these decisions, the man who sat above him as official boss while Casso operated as underboss, and, according to many who knew them both, as the true architect of the violence, was still out there running the organization his own way, and the two of them were about to plunge the family into a period of internal bloodshed that would leave dozens of its own members dead at the hands of their own leadership. Section 8. Whack Jersey. When paranoia became policy. Vittorio Amuso was born on November 4, 1934, and grew up in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, the same borough that had produced so many of the men connected to Lucchese family history before him. In the late 1940s, while still a young man, Amuso was introduced to Anthony Corallo, known as Tony Ducks, a prominent captain at the time, who would go on to become boss of the Lucchese family decades later. That early connection to Corallo placed Amuso on a path inside organized crime that would eventually carry him all the way to the top of the entire organization. By the mid-1980s, Corallo's own time as boss was coming to an end, not through retirement, but through federal prosecution. In 1985, Corallo was indicted alongside the bosses of several other New York crime families in what became known as the Mafia Commission trial, a landmark federal case that successfully convicted the leadership of multiple organized crime families simultaneously, using evidence gathered through years of wiretaps and surveillance. Corallo was convicted and sentenced to 100 years in prison, ending his time as boss and leaving the Lucchese family in need of new leadership. The decision about who would take over fell largely to Christopher Furnari, the same Lucchese figure who had originally brought both Anthony Casso and Vic Amuso into organized crime years earlier. Furnari met privately with his two former protégés and told them they needed to decide between themselves which one of them would take over as the family's new boss. The two men settled on Amuso. He was named acting boss later in 1986 and became the family's official boss on January 13, 1987, once Corallo's conviction made the transition permanent. Casso, his longtime partner in crime going back to their earliest days together on the Brooklyn docks, became his underboss, formalizing a partnership that had already existed in practice for years. Amuso's rise to the top of the Lucchese family did not bring the kind of quiet stability that had defined earlier eras under bosses like Tommy Gagliano or Tommy Lucchese himself. Instead, it opened one of the bloodiest and most chaotic chapters in the entire history of the organization, driven in large part by a federal investigation that would come to be known simply as the Windows case. The Windows case centered on a scheme to rig bids in New York City's replacement window installation industry, an operation prosecutors eventually valued at roughly $150 million. Beyond Windows specifically, the broader investigation also uncovered evidence of corruption reaching into the trucking, air freight, construction, and garbage hauling industries across the city, showing just how deeply organized crime, and the Lucchese family in particular, had embedded itself into the ordinary machinery of doing business in New York. Before the Windows case ever became a federal indictment threatening Amuso's freedom, An entirely separate conflict had already erupted inside the family, one rooted in simple greed rather than any outside law enforcement pressure. Since the 1970s, the Lucchese family had maintained a powerful and profitable presence in northern New Jersey through a group known informally as the Jersey Crew, led for years by a capo named Anthony Acciaturo, known by the nickname Tumac, alongside his longtime protege, Michael Tachetta, who had earned his own nickname, Mad Dog. The Jersey Crew ran illegal gambling, loan sharking, and a wide range of other rackets across northern New Jersey, answering up the chain to New York leadership while maintaining a fair amount of day-to-day independence. Once Amuso took over as boss in 1987, he began demanding a significantly higher percentage of tribute money from the Jersey Crew than the arrangement Acciaturo had operated under for years. Acciaturo refused to simply hand over the increased cut Amuso wanted, and that refusal escalated quickly into open conflict between the family's New York leadership and its New Jersey faction. In the fall of 1988, Amuso summoned the entire Jersey Crew to a meeting in Brooklyn. 10 members of the crew showed up as instructed, but sensing that the meeting might actually be a setup designed to have them killed, all 10 men abruptly turned around and drove away before the meeting could even take place. Amuso reacted to that perceived betrayal with fury. He issued an order that would become one of the most infamous decisions in the family's history: kill the entire Jersey Crew. The order became known informally as Whack Jersey, a blunt, direct command that reflected just how far Amuso was willing to go to punish a faction he felt had defied him. In the aftermath, the entire New Jersey Crew went into hiding, and the Lucchese family's once profitable interests across northern New Jersey were effectively gutted overnight. Amuso and Casso, working together, extended this same logic well beyond the original conflict with Acciaturo, moving to eliminate anyone across the organization they suspected, even on the thinnest evidence, of being disloyal, a potential informant, or a future rival. Over roughly the next 12 months, most of the Jersey Crew members who had initially fled eventually came back into the fold, apparently deciding that continuing to hide indefinitely was worse than facing whatever consequences awaited them. When they returned, Amuso told them directly that Acciaturo himself was the real problem, labeling him an outlaw who needed to be dealt with permanently. Amuso sent men down to Florida, specifically to track down and kill Acciaturo. What Amuso did not realize at the time was that Acciaturo was not hiding out, enjoying his freedom in Florida at all. He was sitting in a New Jersey jail cell, held for refusing to testify in front of a state investigative panel, a location that placed him entirely out of reach of the hitmen Amuso had sent looking for him. With Acciaturo effectively removed from day-to-day control of the Jersey Crew, leadership of the faction passed to his former protege and eventual rival, Michael Tachetta, working alongside his brother Martin Tachetta. Both brothers had originally started in organized crime during the mid-1960s, working under Acciaturo's mentorship in illegal gambling and loan sharking operations that operated on direct orders from Tommy Lucchese himself decades earlier, showing just how far back the Jersey Crew's roots inside the family actually extended. Michael Tachetta had picked up his own criminal conviction back in December of 1971 for operating an illegal lottery and numbers operation, and both brothers continued to build the New Jersey faction's operations through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Acciaturo's fate eventually took a dramatic turn of its own. In 1993, after years spent navigating conflict with Amuso's leadership and facing his own separate legal troubles, Acciaturo made the decision to defect from the Lucchese family entirely and become a government witness. His cooperation directly helped federal prosecutors convict both Michael and Martin Tachetta, the two men who had taken over leadership of the same Jersey Crew he had built and led for decades. It was a striking turn of events. The man Amuso had once tried to have hunted down and killed for defying him ended up outliving that threat entirely, only to later help bring down the very successors who had replaced him. While the internal war with the Jersey Crew played out, an entirely separate threat was building against Amuso from federal investigators focused specifically on the Windows case. In May of 1990, upon learning that an indictment connected to the window bid-rigging scheme was imminent, Amuso fled New York City and went into hiding, becoming a fugitive from federal authorities in much the same way his underboss Casso would do independently around the same period. From whatever hidden locations he was operating out of, Amuso continued to direct Lucchese family business, including, according to later federal indictments, ordering additional murders and attempted murders even while actively evading capture. One of the most significant acts of violence connected to this fugitive period targeted Peter Chiodo, a Lucchese family capo who had originally been indicted alongside other defendants in the Windows case itself. Chiodo, a large man weighing around 450 pounds, eventually pleaded guilty to his role in the bid rigging scheme, a decision that angered Amuso and Casso because it had been made without first securing approval from family leadership. In May of 1991, Chiodo was ambushed at a gas station on Staten Island and shot 12 separate times. He survived the attack, an outcome that surprised almost everyone given the sheer number of times he had been shot. Law enforcement officials believed the assassination attempt had been intended to silence Chiodo permanently and prevent him from cooperating with federal investigators. Instead, surviving the attack pushed him in the opposite direction entirely, and he agreed to become a government witness, eventually testifying against Amuso and providing evidence used in several other organized crime prosecutions as well. In connection with the broader campaign of retaliation surrounding Chiodo's case, 3 additional Lucchese family members named in a later indictment were specifically charged in connection with an earlier attack on Chiodo's family, during which his sister was shot and his uncle was killed, a level of violence against relatives that stood well outside the traditional, if brutal, codes that had governed organized crime violence for decades. Amuso's time as a fugitive finally came to an end in July of 1991, more than a year after he had first gone into hiding. FBI agents captured him at a shopping mall in Dixon City, Pennsylvania, near Scranton, bringing him back to New York to face the charges that had been building against him since the original Windows indictment. In April of 1992, a federal grand jury returned a superseding indictment, meaning an updated and expanded version of the original charges that formed the basis for Amuso's eventual trial. Beyond the original Windows case charges connected to the window bid rigging scheme, the new indictment charged Amuso with conspiracy to commit tax fraud, and with 14 separate counts covering murders, attempted murders, and conspiracies to commit murder, at least 5 of which prosecutors alleged had been carried out specifically while Amuso was still a fugitive hiding from authorities. The indictment described Amuso as holding ultimate and exclusive authority, as boss of the Lucchese family, to approve any murder carried out on the organization's behalf, and it alleged that he had continued exercising that authority actively even while on the run and unable to appear in public. Given the seriousness of the charges and the very real possibility that witnesses or jurors could face intimidation or violence connected to a case involving this much alleged murder, the trial judge granted a motion for an anonymous and sequestered jury, meaning jurors whose identities were kept confidential and who were kept isolated from outside contact for the duration of the trial, a precaution meant to protect them from exactly the kind of pressure that organized crime cases had a history of generating. The trial began in May of 1992, covering the Windows case charges, the murder charges, and the separate allegation that Amuso had conspired to defraud the United States government by filing a false and misleading tax return. In June of 1992, Amuso was convicted on all 54 counts contained in the indictment, covering violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO, along with tax fraud, and the various murder-related charges tied to those broader racketeering violations. Prosecutors had successfully linked Amuso to 9 separate murders and 3 additional attempted killings during the trial, relying heavily on testimony from 2 men who had once served at the very top of the Lucchese family's own internal structure: Peter Chiodo, who had survived his own assassination attempt, and Alphonse Darco, the acting boss who had fled and turned government witness after coming to believe Casso had marked him for death as well. Amuso's conviction came just 2 months after federal prosecutors had also secured a guilty plea against another major organized crime figure of the era, Gambino boss John Gotti, marking a significant 1-2 victory for law enforcement against New York's 5 families within a single year. Amuso was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that permanently ended his ability to operate freely on the streets, though it did not end his formal position at the top of the Lucchese family's leadership structure. Remarkably, Amuso continued to be recognized as the organization's official boss for decades after his conviction, directing family business from behind bars through a rotating cast of acting bosses and leadership panels who managed day-to-day operations on the outside, while Amuso remained the ultimate authority from prison. Assistant United States Attorney Charles Rose gave Amuso a nickname of his own during this era, that captured the sheer scale of violence connected to his leadership, the Deadly Dawn. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even as Amuso's trial exposed the extent of the murders he had ordered, one piece of this same era stayed hidden for years: a secret arrangement between Casso and two decorated Nipe detectives who helped carry out Lucchese killings while still wearing their badges every day. Section 9. The Cops Who Killed for the Mob. Luis Eppolito was born on July 22, 1948, in Brooklyn, New York, into a family that had been connected to organized crime for generations before he was ever born. His mother, Tessie, worked as a registered nurse. His father, Ralph Eppolito, known by the nickname Fats the Gangster, worked as a bookmaker for the Gambino crime family. Beyond his father, Eppolito's paternal uncle, James Eppolito, and his cousin, James Eppolito Jr., were both made members of the Gambino organization as well. Both men were eventually killed by a Gambino soldier named Roy DeMeo, working alongside a capo named Nino Gaggi, showing that even close family ties inside organized crime offered no real protection once internal politics or business disputes turned violent. Despite growing up surrounded by this kind of family history, Eppolito chose a different path, at least on paper. In 1969, at the age of 20, he joined the New York City Police Department as a patrol officer. Over the following 2 decades, he built a public reputation as a decorated detective, eventually writing a memoir published in the early 1990s called Mafia Cop, which portrayed him as an honest officer who had managed to rise above his family's deep ties to organized crime rather than being shaped by them. That public image would later collapse entirely once the full truth about his career came to light. His partner in what would eventually become one of the most notorious police corruption cases in New York City history was Stephen Caracappa, born on November 12, 1942, also in New York City. Caracappa served in the United States Army during the Vietnam War era, before joining the NIPT, where he eventually rose to become a detective assigned to the department's Organized Crime Homicide Unit starting in the late 1970s. Colleagues on the job knew him by the nickname The Stick, a reference to his thin build. Caracappa retired from the NIPT on disability in 1992, closing out a law enforcement career that, on the surface, looked entirely legitimate. Behind that public record, both men had secretly been working for years as paid assets of the Lucchese crime family, specifically serving Lucchese underboss Anthony Casso. Their relationship with Casso ran through an intermediary named Burton Kaplan, a longtime Lucchese associate who served as the go-between connecting Casso's requests to the two detectives and carrying payments back to them in return. According to later court testimony, Casso paid Eppolito and Caracappa roughly $4,000 a month for a steady stream of confidential law enforcement information, including details about pending investigations, informants, and internal police intelligence that could help Casso and his organization stay a step ahead of authorities. Beyond that monthly retainer, the two detectives reportedly received as much as $65,000 for directly carrying out a killing themselves when Casso needed one done. One of the earliest documented killings connected to this arrangement took place in February of 1986, when the two detectives targeted a man named Israel Greenwald, who Casso feared might expose certain illegal operations he had knowledge of. Rather than simply arranging for someone else to handle the killing, Eppolito and Caracappa allegedly used their own police credentials directly, pulling Greenwald over using a fabricated story that he was a suspect in a hit-and-run accident. Once they had him in custody under that false pretense, they took him to an auto garage in Brooklyn, where he was killed. His body was then concealed beneath the garage's concrete floor, hidden in a way specifically designed to make sure it would never be discovered through ordinary means. Later that same year, Casso himself survived an assassination attempt carried out by a rival hit team. In the aftermath, he turned to his relationship with Eppolito and Caracappa to help identify exactly who had been involved in trying to kill him. The two detectives used their access to police databases and investigative resources to compile a list of names and addresses connected to the attempt, a service that went well beyond simply passing along general information, and instead, directly aided Casso in identifying specific targets for retaliation. One of the men on that list was James Heidel, a Gambino associate, believed to have played a role in the failed hit. Eppolito and Caracappa, along with another Lucchese associate, tracked Heidel down at his mother's home before eventually locating him in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn. They kidnapped him and delivered him directly to Casso, who then tortured Heidel to extract information about everyone else who had been involved in the plot against him. During that torture, Heidel gave up a name, Nicky Guido, describing him only as a big kid living in the Court Street section of Brooklyn. Casso then had Heidel killed as well, closing off one more potential witness against him. The problem was that the intelligence Casso received about this specific target turned out to be wrong. Investigators later determined that Ippolito and Caracappa had originally identified the correct Nicholas Guido connected to the plot against Casso, a 29-year-old Gambino associate. Somewhere in the process of gathering and passing along the information, the wrong man with the same name ended up in Casso's crosshairs instead. On Christmas Day of 1986, a 26-year-old man named Nicholas Guido was standing outside his mother's home in Brooklyn, showing off a new car he had recently bought, when he was shot and killed. This Nicholas Guido had no actual connection to organized crime, no involvement in the plot against Casso, and no idea why anyone would want him dead. He simply happened to share a name and a similar age with the man Casso's people were actually looking for. His mother ran outside after hearing the gunshots and found her son still sitting upright behind the wheel of his car, already dead. Two Lucchese associates, George Zappola and Frank Lastarino, are believed to have carried out the actual shooting once Ippolito and Caracappa supplied Casso with an address and photograph connected to the wrong man's identity. 4 years later, in November of 1990, the same two detectives were connected to another killing tied directly to Casso's business, this time targeting Edward Lino, a capo in the Gambino crime family whom Casso suspected of involvement in an earlier attempt on his own life. The two detectives pulled Lino over on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, using their police authority, and Caracappa shot him at close range once the car was stopped. Taken together, prosecutors eventually built a case against Ippolito and Caracappa, alleging their direct participation in, or assistance with, 8 separate murders, 2 attempted murders, and 1 additional murder conspiracy, spanning roughly from the mid-1980s through the early 1990s. Beyond the killings themselves, the two men were also accused of obstruction of justice, drug distribution, and money laundering, painting a picture of two working police detectives who had spent years operating as a fully integrated arm of organized crime violence, while still collecting paychecks from the city of New York and maintaining public reputations as respected members of law enforcement. Both men eventually retired from the NIPDED and relocated to Las Vegas, Nevada, where they purchased homes in the same neighborhood, apparently continuing their friendship and their connections to organized crime, even after leaving New York and leaving active police work behind. Their relationship with the criminal world did not end simply because they had moved across the country. In 1993, both men were reportedly involved in a failed plot targeting John Gotti Jr. and several other New York organized crime figures, and they were also believed to have been searching for Sammy Gravano, the Gambino underboss who had become a government witness against John Gotti, suggesting the two former detectives were still willing to involve themselves in serious organized crime violence years after leaving the police force entirely. The first real threat to their secret finally emerged in 1994, when Anthony Casso, arrested the previous year and facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators and began offering information about a wide range of criminal activity connected to his time as Lucchese underboss, including detailed information about his relationship with Ippolito and Caracappa. For a moment, it looked as though this cooperation might finally expose the two detectives to prosecution, but Casso's own cooperation deal fell apart due to his dishonesty and erratic behavior during debriefing sessions, and he was removed from the witness protection program before his information about the two former detectives could be fully used against them in court. That setback delayed justice in the case by more than a decade. What eventually cracked the case open was the cooperation of Burton Kaplan, the same longtime Lucchese associate who had served for years as the go-between connecting Casso's requests to Ippolito and Caracappa. After facing his own legal troubles, Kaplan agreed to cooperate with federal investigators, providing the kind of first-hand, detailed testimony about the relationship between the two detectives and Casso that prosecutors needed to finally build a solid case. His cooperation, combined with years of additional investigative work by the FBI and federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York, eventually led to a full indictment against both men. On March 9, 2005, federal agents arrested Ippolito and Caracappa in Las Vegas. catching them as they arrived at an Italian restaurant called Piero's near the Las Vegas Strip. At the time of his arrest, Caracappa was working as an assistant chief of security at a women's prison facility in North Las Vegas, a detail that added another layer of irony to a case built around two former police officers who had spent years secretly working for organized crime. The following day, prosecutors unsealed a federal indictment charging both men with racketeering conspiracy, obstruction of justice, extortion, money laundering, narcotics dealing, witness tampering, and 8 separate murder counts, formally laying out the full scope of what investigators believed the two men had done while still active members of the NYPD. The trial began in March of 2006 in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Prosecutors argued that the two men had used their police badges as a license to kill on behalf of the mob, receiving steady monthly payments for information and large lump sums for carrying out killings directly. One federal prosecutor described the case as one of the most violent betrayals of a police badge the city had ever seen. Defense attorneys pushed back hard, arguing that Ippolito and Caracappa were honest public servants who had been falsely targeted by mobsters desperate to avoid prison time themselves by shifting blame onto two convenient, high-profile former officers. The jury did not agree with the defense. In 2006, Ippolito and Caracappa were convicted on the full range of charges against them, including the murder-related counts tied to their years of work for Casso. But the case took a significant and unexpected legal turn almost immediately afterward. The trial judge, Jack Weinstein, issued a lengthy ruling in which he acknowledged that the evidence presented at trial overwhelmingly established the two men's participation in a long list of violent and serious crimes. Despite that finding, Weinstein ruled that the law required him to set aside the jury's guilty verdict on the most serious charges, because the 5-year statute of limitations, meaning the legal deadline for prosecuting a specific crime, had already expired on the murders themselves by the time the case was formally brought to trial. Defense attorneys had successfully argued that too much time had passed since the killings for those specific charges to still be prosecutable under federal law, even though the underlying evidence of guilt was not seriously in question. That ruling threw the entire case into uncertainty for more than a year. Federal prosecutors appealed Weinstein's decision, arguing that the killings should be understood as part of one long, ongoing criminal conspiracy that continued well past the original murders themselves, stretching all the way up through a 2005 drug transaction connected to an FBI informant, which would have kept the case within the legal time limit for prosecution. An appeals court ultimately agreed with prosecutors, reversing Weinstein's decision and clearing the way for the case to move forward to formal sentencing after years of legal delay. In March of 2009, Ippolito and Caracappa were finally sentenced for their crimes. Ippolito received a sentence of life in prison for his conspiracy conviction, plus an additional 100 years for various other offenses including money laundering, along with a fine of $4.7 million. Caracappa received a life sentence plus 80 additional years, along with a fine of $4.2 million. Between them, the two former detectives had logged a combined 44 years of service on the New York City police force, all of it now permanently overshadowed by the years they had spent secretly working as paid killers for organized crime. The fallout from the case continued well beyond the criminal sentencing itself. In 2010, New York City agreed to pay $9.9 million to a man who had spent 19 years in prison after Ippolito and Caracappa had framed him for the murder of a woman he had nothing to do with, a wrongful conviction directly tied to the two detectives' corrupt use of their police authority. In 2015, the city reached a separate $5 million settlement with the family of Nicholas Guido, the innocent 26-year-old killed outside his mother's home on Christmas Day in 1986, due to the case of mistaken identity created by the two detectives' faulty information. Caracappa spent his remaining years in federal custody battling declining health, including a long fight with cancer. In April of 2016, he lost an appeal seeking to have his conviction overturned. 2 months later, he filed a request for compassionate release based on his deteriorating medical condition. The judge overseeing his case responded that there was nothing that could be done to grant that request under the circumstances. Stephen Caracappa died in a prison medical facility in Butner, North Carolina, on April 8, 2017, at the age of 75. Luis Ippolito died 2 years later, on November 3, 2019, at a hospital in Tucson, Arizona, while still in federal custody, at the age of 71. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Mafia cops case remains one of the most shocking instances of police corruption in the history of the New York City Police Department. A story of two decorated detectives who spent years secretly serving as paid killers and information sources for the Lucchese crime family while wearing a badge every single day. Their partnership with Casso ended in life sentences, tens of millions of dollars in city settlements, and a permanent stain on the department's history. But even after Casso's downfall, Amuso's life sentence, and the eventual exposure of two corrupt detectives, the organization all three men had once served did not simply disappear once its most violent leaders were gone. Section 10. Still standing. The family that never fully fell. Vic Amuso has remained the official boss of the Lucchese crime family since 1987, a position he has now held for close to 4 decades, despite having been locked away since his 1992 conviction on murder and racketeering charges. That distinction makes him, as of recent years, the longest-serving boss of any of New York's 5 families, still recognized in that role. A strange kind of continuity for an organization that spent the early 1990s tearing itself apart from the inside. Amuso's health has declined significantly in recent years. Court filings describe a man in his late 80s dealing with severe arthritis that leaves him unable to move around without a wheelchair, worsening vision problems, and the loss of all of his teeth, conditions that have led his legal team to repeatedly request what is known as compassionate release, a legal process that allows federal prisoners suffering from serious medical conditions or advanced age to petition for release from custody. As of recent filings, those requests have continued to be denied, with federal courts finding, even years into his life sentence, that Amuso still holds enough influence and connection to organized crime activity that his continued incarceration remains justified. He remains housed at the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. Despite being physically removed from the streets since his capture in 1991, Amuso continued directing Lucchese family business from behind bars for decades, relying on a rotating structure of acting bosses and leadership panels, largely drawn from the family's Bronx faction, to manage day-to-day criminal operations on the outside, while he remained the organization's ultimate authority from prison. This arrangement kept the family functioning, generating profit through construction rackets, gambling operations, and other traditional Lucchese businesses, even without a boss who could physically walk the streets or meet with associates in person. That arrangement held for years, until a single murder from 2013 unraveled the family's entire visible leadership structure and exposed just how much organized crime activity was still running underneath the surface of New York City, more than 2 decades after Amuso and Casso's downfall. On November 15, 2013, a man named Michael Meldish was found shot to death inside his car in the Bronx. Meldish had a long history connected to organized crime in the city, having once led a violent street gang known as the Purple Gang, which had done work over the years for both the Lucchese and Genovese crime families. By 2013, Meldish had fallen out of favor with Lucchese leadership after refusing to help collect debts owed to Matthew Madonna, who was serving as the family's acting boss at the time. According to federal prosecutors, that refusal angered Madonna enough that he ordered Meldish killed, setting off a chain of command that ran directly through the highest levels of the organization. The investigation into Meldish's murder moved slowly at first. In February of 2017, federal prosecutors charged a Lucchese soldier named Christopher Londonio and an associate named Terrence Caldwell with racketeering offenses connected specifically to the killing. That initial indictment turned out to be just the opening piece of a much larger case. A few months later, in June of 2017, prosecutors unsealed a sweeping superseding indictment, meaning an expanded and updated version of the original charges, that ultimately named 19 members and associates of the Lucchese family, covering essentially the entire visible leadership structure of the organization at that time. The indictment charged Matthew Madonna, described as the family's street boss, Stephen Crea Sr., known by the nickname Wonder Boy, and identified as the family's underboss, Stephen Crea Jr., described as a captain and Londonio's superior within the organization, and Joseph DiNapoli, identified as the family's consigliere, meaning a senior advisor role, traditionally considered one of the top 3 positions inside any organized crime family, alongside the boss and underboss. Beyond these top leadership figures, the indictment also named soldiers and associates, including Dominic Trusello, John Castellucci, known as Big John, Tindaro Corso, known as Tino, Joseph Venice, James Mafucci, known as Jimmy the Jew, Joseph Datello, known as Big Joe or Joey Glasses, and Paul Casano, known as Paulie Roast Beef, among several others. The specific allegations laid out by prosecutors described a clear chain of command behind the Meldish killing. Madonna, angered by Meldish's refusal to collect debts on his behalf, ordered the murder. Crea Sr., as underboss, participated in that decision and relayed the order down through lower-ranking members of the family. Londonio was accused of setting up the actual killing, arranging the specific details needed to carry it out, while Caldwell was accused of being the one who actually pulled the trigger. Beyond the murder charge itself, the broader indictment covered a wide range of additional racketeering activity, including extortion of labor union members, loan sharking, illegal gambling operations, and drug trafficking, painting a picture of an organization that, despite decades of prosecutions against its earlier leadership, had continued running many of the same basic rackets that had defined Lucchese family business for generations. The case against Madonna, Crea Sr., Londonio, and Caldwell went to trial in the fall of 2019, ultimately stretching across a 6-week jury trial in front of United States District Judge Kathy Seibel. On November 15, 2019, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all 4 men, convicting them of murder, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and other felony charges connected to the broader Lucchese enterprise. The timing of that verdict carried a specific, almost symbolic weight. The conviction came down exactly 6 years to the day after Michael Meldish had originally been killed, a coincidence federal prosecutors publicly noted at the time as a fitting close to the case. Sentencing followed over the following months. Madonna, Londonio, and Caldwell were each sentenced to life in prison for their roles in the murder and the broader racketeering conspiracy connected to it. Crea Sr. was sentenced separately at a later date, also ultimately receiving a life sentence, closing out the prosecution of what had effectively been the entire visible top leadership of the Lucchese family at the time of the original indictment. Stephen Crea Jr., the underboss's son, resolved his own case separately from his father's, pleading guilty to charges connected to conspiring with his father to kill a Bonanno crime family associate named Carl Olsheimer, a plot separate from the Meldish killing itself. Though the original indictment had also accused Crea Jr. of involvement in the Meldish murder specifically, that particular charge was not part of the guilty plea he ultimately entered, and he faced a maximum sentence of 13 years for the charges he did admit to. Taken together, the 2017 indictment and the trials and sentences that followed represented one of the most significant single blows to Lucchese family leadership since the Amuso and Caso convictions decades earlier. In the span of a single federal case, the organization lost its street boss, its underboss, its consigliere, and several capos and soldiers all at once, each sentenced to spend the rest of their lives, or a significant portion of them, behind bars. Even a loss of that scale did not end the organization entirely. With the Bronx faction leadership essentially wiped out through life sentences, Amuso, still directing family affairs from his prison cell in North Carolina, reportedly issued new instructions through smuggled communication, restoring control of the family to its Brooklyn faction instead. Under this restructuring, a man known as Michael DeSantis, nicknamed Big Mike, was installed as the new acting boss. Patrick Delarusso, known as Patty Red, took over as underboss, and a man named Andrew DeSimone was elevated to the position of consigliere. Additional smaller cases continued to surface in the years that followed, including a group of Lucchese family members and associates who pleaded guilty in connection with a gambling and racketeering operation tied to the family's New Jersey faction, the same geographic territory that had once been the target of Amuso's infamous whack jersey order back in the late 1980s. The most recent major case to expose ongoing Lucchese family activity came in October of 2025, in a scheme that reached far beyond typical organized crime circles and into the world of professional basketball. On October 23, 2025, federal officials announced 2 separate but related indictments covering more than 30 individuals across 11 states. One indictment, referred to by investigators as Operation Nothing But Bet, targeted an insider sports betting scheme that exploited confidential information about basketball players and teams. Miami Heat guard Terry Rozier was charged in connection with this scheme, accused of informing associates ahead of time that he planned to leave a February 2023 game early due to injury, allowing those associates to place substantial bets predicting his underperformance before the information became public. He reportedly left that specific game after only 9 minutes, citing a foot injury. The second and larger indictment, called Operation Royal Flush, targeted a scheme to rig underground poker games across multiple cities, using sophisticated cheating technology, including specialized card shuffling machines and high-tech eyewear that allowed conspirators to read the backs of playing cards during a game, giving them an enormous and completely hidden advantage over other players at the table. Victims of the scheme were reportedly lured into these high-stakes games partly through the presence of recognizable basketball figures. Portland Trail Blazers head coach Chauncey Billups and former NBA player Damon Jones were both charged in connection with this poker scheme, accused of helping organize and legitimize the rigged games in exchange for a cut of the profits generated by cheating unsuspecting participants. According to New York City Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch, one victim alone lost $1.8 million in these manufactured rigged poker matches. Across the full scheme, prosecutors estimated total victim losses at approximately $7 million. What made this case especially significant from an organized crime perspective was the scope of Mafia involvement it exposed. According to the indictment, members and associates connected to 4 of New York's 5 traditional organized crime families, the Bonanno, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organizations, were all directly involved in backing these rigged poker games, collecting a share of the profits generated through the cheating scheme, and using threats, extortion, and in some cases physical violence to enforce payment from players who fell into debt during the games. One of the poker locations connected to the scheme operated out of a nondescript building in Manhattan's Kips Bay neighborhood, tied specifically to the Bonanno family, while a separate location in Greenwich Village was connected to the Gambino organization. Proceeds from the scheme were reportedly laundered in part through cryptocurrency transactions, reflecting how organized crime groups with roots going back nearly a century have continued adapting their methods to modern financial tools. A man named Seth Trustman was specifically identified in the indictment as an associate connected to the Lucchese crime family's role in the broader scheme. Law enforcement officials described the scale of cooperation between 4 separate crime families working together on a single scheme as extraordinarily rare, noting that it reflected both how deeply organized crime still operates beneath the surface of everyday life in New York City, and how much sustained investigative work it took to expose a scheme spanning multiple organizations, multiple cities, and connections reaching all the way into professional basketball. FBI Director Kash Patel and federal prosecutors publicly framed the arrests as a clear message that organized crime activity of this kind, no matter how sophisticated or well hidden, remains an active target for federal law enforcement. Taken as a whole, the story of the Lucchese crime family runs from Gaetano Reina's ice monopoly in the 1920s Bronx, through Tommy Lucchese's politically connected reign, through Jimmy Burke's crew turning one airport heist into a body count bigger than the robbery itself, through Casso and Amuso's murder spree, through 2 corrupt NIPD detectives moonlighting as hitmen, and into a 2017 case that wiped out an entire generation of the family's leadership. And yet in 2025, nearly a century after Reina's ice trucks, associates connected to the same organization were still finding new ways to make money, this time with rigged card shufflers instead of shotguns. Federal estimates once put Lucchese membership near 100 made men and 200 associates. As of 2021, the number was around 121 made members, an organization smaller than its peak, but still standing, still earning, and still drawing indictments a century after it started. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.